This week on Viewpoints.
There's kids in middle schools writing essays about Hamlet contemplating unaliving himself.
From Riz to Unalive, our slang is evolving faster than ever. What do these words say about our culture today? Then,
you press on. You meet crisis with pragmatism and with planning rather than with falling apart.
The natural resilience we're all born with. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth this week on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
when you hear a teenager casually drop words like Riz, SKIBIDI, or even unalive, you may wonder, where do these odd phrases come from and how do they spread so quickly into the vocabulary of young people? That's the world linguist Adam Alexic studies. Alexic is the author of the new book, Algo-Speak: How Social Media is Transforming the Future of Language. He's fascinated by how slang evolves in the digital age and how words born online can take over real-world speech in months or even weeks.
An example is the word unalive, which you can't say kill on TikTok, so many people instead say unalive. And this actually bleeds into offline, and there's kids in middle schools writing essays about Hamlet contemplating unaliving himself. But that's not actually new speak, it's just people finding a new way to express themselves.
What makes unalive so striking is that it's no longer just internet shorthand, it's made its way into classrooms and everyday conversations. He points out how even the most ordinary words carry little cultural jokes if you trace them back far enough.
One of the first words I ever did on my blog that I started in high school was the word sophomore. I really like this one. It comes from the same roots as the word sophisticated and moron in ancient Greek. So the sophomore means wise fool. And that's what I mean when I say I got into it for the fun facts. It's just really cool to see that. But at the same time, it tells you something about how people conceptualize sophomores. There's a little story held within it. It is this age where you think you know everything, and at the same time, you're a little foolish about some things.
Language has always been inventive. Every generation leaves its fingerprints in words, whether it's a centuries-old wise fool or TikTok slang spreading at record speed. He says platforms like TikTok and Instagram and the algorithms these companies use to shape what users see aren't just reflecting how young people talk, they're actively shaping it.
There's always been, for example, young people identifying with new words as a way to forge their own identity, as a way to differentiate their identity from adults. At the same time, I think algorithms are bringing us these words faster. They're causing the words to form more quickly because they incentivize the creation of echo chambers that then create their own language. And then they open up those echo chambers just enough to allow those words to spread, but they also compound natural human trends. We've always had trends we've always had in groups, but algorithms push that even more.
Slang is nothing new, of course. Every generation coins its own words, but Alexic cautions that calling something millennial or Gen Z slang misses the larger point.
These labels are made up, Gen Z, millennial. The idea of a social generation didn't exist until the early 1900s, and then over time we begin to think that they're more and more real, and there is no such thing as Gen Z language. In fact, ascribing that label maybe kind of flattens the true stories of where a lot of these words are coming from. In fact, if you go to Wikipedia, you can find pages for Gen Z and Gen Alpha slang. There's no page for millennial slang. There's only a page for 2000 slang. And it's kind of a new thing that we start thinking of slang as such a generational thing. Slang used to be this countercultural kind of phenomenon where it's just not formal language.
And where this slang originates from matters. Alexic points out that today's slang often draws from two main sources: African American English and online subcultures like the manosphere. That tells us something about power, identity, and who drives what's seen as cool. Another way younger generations communicate: emojis. Alexic says they're not just fun add-ons, but in this digital age are words in their own right.
Emojis are words. I can't emphasize that strongly enough. I mean, words come from the increasing abstraction of pictographs, and emojis are just a new pictograph. It's something, you look at it, it holds meaning. That's a word, right? And so just like words, emojis evolve meaning over time. We started out with the laughing, crying emoji to indicate laughter, but among younger people, that became semantically bleached, meaning that it lost its sort of meaning. It became overused and it became thought of as ironic. So then people moved to the crying emoji, and then that got overused, and people moved to the skull emoji, and then that got overused. Now there's the heartbreak emoji or the wilting rose emoji. So we're constantly cycling between different words depending on the social context. And words really do evolve meanings, as do emojis.
Alexic says that emojis, unlike slang words, have a limited keyboard of options on your smartphone or other device. So, how do companies decide which emojis make the cut?
These emojis are being pushed by algorithms as well. The new meanings I was talking about, the wilting rose and the heartbreak emoji and the skull emoji, those were all popularized through algorithmic trends. And it seems like this cycle of moving through different emojis to express irony, that's accelerating. And you see the same thing with other emojis changing meaning. There's a new trend every other week with somebody trying to popularize some emoji or another. But the thing is, these fads die out. Once your grandmother starts saying skibidi or starts using the skull emoji, it's no longer cool and you want to move on.
Slang and emojis can feel ridiculous, even cartoonish, but Alexic argues that it's all part of the cycle. When you look back at phrases like kick the bucket, those might have sounded just as silly once. So what does the future hold for how we speak? Alexic believes that these trends will continue to be driven for many years by social media algorithms and artificial intelligence.
Individual slang words, I don't think skibidi, for example, is going to stay around. Individual slang words do die out because, again, they're tied to meme lifespans. And I strongly believe that they found the most addicting medium to recommend us content. I don't think that'll be going anywhere for a while. So you can pay attention and start seeing the exact same trends with every new word until we find that more addictive medium. And the trends are that there's an in-group that feels like they have a space to use their language. There's a context collapse where somebody reinterprets that in a new setting. And then the words slowly move across these filter bubbles, echo chambers online, are popularized as broad trends, and then are reused by creators because the creators want to tap into a trend. That is a cycle we will continue seeing over and over again until we move on from the algorithm, which I don't think we will for a minute.
He emphasizes that it's not really about the specific slang terms themselves, which will always come and go. As AI continues to expand in use, this technology will play a bigger role in what words rise to the top and become popular in our everyday language.
These algorithms operate on AI. They're run through large language models, and they decide how to recommend content based on deep learning. This is AI. And yes, AI, GPT, that kind of stuff is getting more sophisticated. We're seeing more AI recommended content. We're seeing people start to talk more like ChatGPT. All of this definitely will influence things. I think the algorithms are also going to get more sophisticated. So words like unalive, which are now also censored, they won't last as long either. If anything, AI is going to get better at identifying words in context. It will never be perfect because AI's representation of language is never perfect. But what you'll see is that it will push people to produce more ways to talk about things they want to talk about faster. And if anything, we're going to have more language change going on.
What today's slang really shows us is how deeply technology has threaded itself into culture. Algorithms may feel invisible, but they're steering how we joke, how we connect, and even how we grieve. The story of language is the story of us, and right now, it's being written faster than ever. To learn more about our guest, Adam Alexic, and his book AlgoSpeak, head to viewpointsradio.org. For more behind the scenes, follow Viewpoints Radio on Instagram, Facebook, and X. This story was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. Our studio manager is Jason Dickey. I'm Gary Price.
Coming up, the resilient story of one couple lost at sea for 4 months when Viewpoints returns. What makes some people crumble in the face of disaster while others find a way to push through? Psychologists call this trait quality resilience. And while it might sound like something you either have or don't, the truth is more complicated. Resilience doesn't always mean being fearless or unshakable. Sometimes it's a quiet persistence and a will not to give in or give up. Researcher George Bonanno, a professor of clinical psychology at the Teachers College at Columbia University, has been studying and mapping this trait out for more than 35 years.
We find most people are resilient to potentially traumatic events, but we've had a very difficult time until relatively recently making sense of that, understanding how we can determine who will be resilient and who not.
Bonanno is also the author of The End of Trauma, how the new science of resilience is changing how we think of PTSD.
We've measured many different factors. There's a kind of a common idea that there's 3 or 4 magic traits that resilient people have. And you see these sort of headlines, the 4 qualities of highly resilient people or whatever. But we've measured maybe, my team and other people, other researchers have measured 50, 60, 70 different factors. And we find many, many correlates of resilience. So lots of things correlate with resilience. There are lots of healthy things that we can assume would make us resilient.
For example, you might assume that people who are adaptable, flexible, and optimistic are likely to be more resilient than people who aren't. But Bonanno says these traits don't necessarily predict this. He calls this the resilience paradox.
We can measure all these things, but we still can't predict resilience. So that's led me and my team and other researchers also to develop an alternative way of thinking about these events that involves what I call flexibility, or regulatory flexibility, adaptive flexibility. We may have lots of positive characteristics, but every event is different. Every challenge, every life-threatening, highly aversive, disturbing event is different. It presents us with a different challenge. And so we have to adapt to that event. We have to figure out what's going to work in this situation. And, if you think about it, being in the pandemic, which we all went through recently, was a very different kind of challenge than, say, being in an automobile accident or being lost at sea.
Speaking of being lost at sea, in 1972, a British couple, Maurice and Marilyn Bailey, were in this exact position. They spent 4 months in a small rubber life raft on the Pacific Ocean after their sailboat sank. They ran out of food and fresh water after 20 days. So how did they manage to survive for 3 more months?
You press on, right? You meet crisis with pragmatism and with planning rather than with falling apart.
That's Sophie Elmhirst, journalist and author of A Marriage at Sea. It was during the pandemic that she came across this virtually forgotten story about the Baileys. She learned that out of the 2, Marilyn Bailey exhibited far more resilience than her husband, Maurice.
To be fair, in Maurice's mind as well, I think he was very quick, both publicly and privately, to sort of say that she kept them alive and that it was thanks to her that they survived. And that was her ingenuity, her pragmatism, her stoicism, but it was also her kind of almost arranged optimism, this sense that she just wasn't going to give up. She would just believe that they would survive, and she had all sorts of sort of strategies to retain that faith.
On the other hand, Maurice, like many of us, felt defeated and like all hope was lost.
I think that's absolutely fair to say that she did the hard job of survival for them both, really. She very quickly was like, right, we need projects, so they had 2 books that they got off their boat before it sank. She was like, right, we'll go through them line by line. We'll discuss every line. She knew it was very important that, there was a physical component like the fishing, in the water, but there was also this mental component. They needed to keep their minds busy. She had them playing cards that they made out of paper, dominoes that they made as well. And she was constantly planning. I think that was something that really struck me from her diary, that you see all these doodles and drawings of dresses she's designing and menus that she's planning and lists of elaborate sort of cakes and sandwiches and drinks and, picnics, occasions that, that she's sort of clearly, almost sort of salivating over in her mind. And partly that's probably due to starvation, but it's also I think is a kind of imaginative exercise of willpower.
Marilyn also jumped into action and adapted the few supplies they'd been able to save. For example, she salvaged a safety pin, bent it into a fishing hook, and was able to catch fish, and later sea turtles.
They would eat turtle eyeballs. They've discovered that there was sort of kind of a gooey kind of juice that came out of the eggs from turtles as well, sort of ways of trying to get other kinds of protein or moisture. Anyway, they were nothing if not creative, I suppose, in how they found things to eat.
Several ships passed during the couple's 4-month-long ordeal in the small lifeboat, but apparently the people on board didn't see them and sailed right on by. When the 7th ship sailed out of view, Marilyn finally gave in to despair, but only briefly.
There are these brief moments, especially when a ship goes past and doesn't see them, or the weather's really bad, when she'll write something like despair, depressed, no hope, or, it'll be a very brief The next day, she's back into kind of documenting something or planning something or coming up with some new idea. So you feel like she allows them a very limited, literal amount of space on the page. And it's sort of, I feel like that corresponds to the amount of space she allowed them in her mind in a way.
Maurice freely admitted after they were finally rescued by a Korean fishing ship that he would have never survived had it not been for his partner's ingenuity and optimism. Maybe it was experience that allowed Marilyn to keep calm, regulate her emotions, and adapt to the situation. Traits that Bonanno points to as the core of resilience.
The whole process of development is about learning how we regulate ourselves. And it actually maps very nicely onto this concept of flexibility. And most people actually at least moderate skill in these different flexibility components and working out, how do I respond to this situation? That said, I think it's very much ripe for people to get better at these skills, to improve in these skills. And I'm doing a lot of research on that right now, on whether we can train people, how we can train people to be more flexible, to better use these skills. It's a very natural human trait already. We are very flexible. We have very flexible brains, but it is how we learn, how we behave in the world. And it really helps us to understand that and perhaps try to do that more effectively.
Bonanno believes we can build resilience early on by introducing kids to challenging events or tasks and allowing them to fail. We learn through our mistakes, and it's in the challenges that we grow. Sophie Elmhirst's book, A Marriage at Sea, and George Bonanno's book, The End of Trauma, How the New Science of Resilience is Changing How We Think of PTSD, are available now online and can be requested through your local bookstore. To find out more about our guests this week, visit viewpointsradio.org. This story was written and produced by Polly Hansen. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. Our studio manager is Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson. This segment is brought to you by Capital One. Banking with Capital One helps you keep more money in your wallet with no fees or minimums on checking accounts and no overdraft fees. What's in your wallet? Terms apply. See CapitalOne.com/bank for details. Capital One, N.A., member FDIC.
Viewpoints returns in just a moment.
This is Viewpoints Explained. I'm Ebony McMorris. If you're lucky enough to have bought gold 20 years ago, you're probably pretty happy right now. Back in the early 2000s, the price per ounce was just under $400. Today, this number sits at just over $3,600 per ounce, according to investment firm America Hartford Gold. The real surprise has been what's happened just in the last year. Since 2024, gold's value has skyrocketed by 55%. So what's driving this modern gold rush? Experts say it's a mix of inflation, global uncertainty, and the rising demand as investors search for safer places to invest than the stock market. Historically speaking, gold is known to be a safe bet when currencies weaken or when interest rates don't keep up with inflation. But here's the real question. With prices so high, does it make sense to buy gold? Financial experts say yes, because it still serves a different purpose than typical investments. It doesn't pay dividends like stocks or interest like bonds. Instead, its main role is stability. Think of it less as a way to get rich and more as an insurance policy if other assets lose value. That said, more experts don't recommend putting a large chunk of your savings into gold. Instead, most suggest keeping just a small slice, anywhere between 5 to 10%. If you've never invested in gold, the simplest route is through exchange-traded funds or ETFs, funds you can buy and sell like a stock that track the price of gold. With these, you don't have to physically store it yourself. If you do want the actual metal, experts recommend sticking with government mints, established precious metal dealers, or accredited coin shops. These places have transparent pricing and guaranteed authenticity. If you're getting in at today's prices, it's more about long-term protection and not profit. That's Viewpoints Explained for this week. More in a moment.
Welcome to Culture Crash, where we examine what's new and old in entertainment. Last year, audiences were thrilled by The Substance, a body horror satire that deliriously took on beauty standards and the gold rush of products that promised people, but specifically women, could look younger and more beautiful if only they buy the right stuff. Anchored by star performances from both Demi Moore and Margaret Qualley, The Substance went from a niche horror movie out of Cannes to securing 5 Oscar nominations and 1 win. This year, the movie Him was sold on a similar premise, but for men. Him is a football-adjacent horror movie that follows a young up-and-coming QB who goes to train with a retiring legend. In its long and exciting ad campaign, Him was sold as a horror satire that would explore the pressure our society puts on young men to excel at sports and the crushing weight of an entire city demanding perfection from its athletes. But the actual release of the movie Him was met with a groan and some collective disappointment. Where The Substance was clever and provocative, Him is obvious in one note. It's full of scenes that subvert the audience's expectations with shocking acts of violence, but don't actually take the story anywhere new. Its script is chock full of youthful language, with characters constantly saying things like, "He's the GOAT," or "Of course I'm him." But the script is sorely lacking in any actual insight, or even moments of great dramatic tension. And it's a real shame, because in its somehow overlong 96 minutes, the film does have some bright spots. Lead actor Tyreek Withers is great as the wide-eyed young QB desperate to prove himself. And Julia Fox gives a hammed-up performance that hints at a more fun version of this movie that may have existed at some point in its development. Maybe the movie's biggest strength is in its visual language. Him features a number of sequences that are expertly lit, shot, and edited, including some very cool moments where the camera seemingly snaps into an X-ray visualizer. But maybe the whole thing should have just been a short film or a music video. Despite its promising thematic concerns, the movie Him is a dud. I'm Evan Rook.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.